So I was thinking this 28, 1970. That sounds good for everybody. And then we'll transition from there and see if there's anything else we want to talk about for this test. Yeah. Okay, so we got 1970. Okay. If we look at kind of big picture, what's happening here? We looked at the 60s with a lot of social change, right? A lot of protests, demands for more rights, whether that was the African American Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Liberation Movement, Native Americans, Chicano movement, and lots of change. Then we get in the 70s, this is our transition period, where there is still forces of change, but the growing power of the reactionary side saying, no, let's have less change. Okay. To the point where we get to the 1980s and the side to saying no change gains the power. Okay, so we're transitioning from lots of change to no change, or going back to the way things were, and the 70s is the middle ground. Okay, and so if we look at some political changes happening during this time, probably the biggest political change is going to be what happens with Watergate. Okay. So we have to kind of give like a short summary of what Watergate is, right? Pro-Nixon men break into the Democratic Party, their headquarters, and Nixon at first, once they're discovered, says, I didn't know anything about it. I have no knowledge of this. I have no power over these people. But it turns out he kind of did have some power over them. There's no evidence showing that he said to do it, but there is some evidence to say that he knew about it beforehand. And so Nixon tries to cover it up. There are a series of tapes that of voice recordings showing his involvement in it. And so eventually it was released with some of the tape actually redacted, cut out from what was released. So we don't know what was said in that full tape. But eventually that's going to lead to his impeachment with enough evidence that he knew something and he was using his power of the presidency to cover it up. And so that leads him to resign. There's a whole lot more that goes into it, but this is the super basic summary of Watergate. So his vice president, who is who? Ford, ascends to the presidency. Remember, he is actually the only president to become president who never got a single vote for a presidential ticket because he was appointed after Nixon's initial vice president resigns. So Ford becomes president, and what's the controversial thing he does with Nixon? He pardons Nixon, which means he forgives him of any federal crimes that he committed while he was president. And so after this, people are concerned that the presidency has gained too much power, so much so that it can become corrupt. And so there's a series of laws they did to restrict presidential powers. Can you think of any? Freedom of Information Act. So that presidents and really anyone in government can't hide information. War Powers Act, which gave powers to fight war back to Congress, taking it away from the presidency. Those are the big political changes. Let's go to social. We talked about the African American Civil Rights Movement and how much change there was in the 1960s. In the 1970s, groups are looking for what is the new goal, right? It was de facto segregation. So discrimination not based off of law, but based off of practices and past discrimination. And so how do you get rid of that? One way was through affirmative action. Where different organizations or government agencies are trying to correct the wrongs of historical discrimination. So if a government or school or college has been historically discriminatory towards one group, that group is going, or the college or the government is going to take action to basically right that wrong in the future. And so the common example of this is college enrollment. Not the only example, but it's a common example that's talked about. With at the time in the 70s, different schools saying, okay, we're going to allow this number of people from this race or this ethnicity to come into the United States or to our college, because historically they've been denied access to colleges and higher learning. And so this leads us to Lockheed versus University of California, which said two things. Race as a factor is okay, but quotas are not okay. So it can be used as like a way to create a profile of this person, of the applicant, but you can't put like a physical number attached to how many people you enroll or like a point system or anything like that. You can't do that. We also talked about women's rights, right? So we have increasingly feminist movements in the 1970s seeking political, social, economic equality for women, whether it's fighting for an Equal Pay Act, Title IX, which gives educational opportunity, equal educational opportunities for girls. It looks like IX, but it's 9, so that's schools. So classes can be for boys and girls. Sports can be for either gender. We have the Equal Rights Amendment, which is a proposed amendment saying the government cannot restrict certain rights from people because of their sex. It is proposed, it goes around to states, and there is one woman who is going to fight against this and become the voice of the anti-ERA movement. What's her name? Phyllis Schlafly. So in the eyes of women's rights movements in the 60s and 70s, Phyllis Schlafly is harmful to the expansion of women's rights. She's trying to limit those rights according to those groups. Yes. Why she didn't want to? Yeah, so a couple reasons. One, or her biggest reason was because she believed in traditional roles for women. And she believed that by creating an Equal Rights Amendment, it would make that more difficult to continue. For example, an Equal Rights Amendment, then you could not have a deferment for a draft for women. Like right now, even today in 2023, if there was a draft, it would be for male citizens only. But if you pass this ERA, you would not be able to say only men because that's based on sex. And so they couldn't do that. So that's an example where she said, like, if we went to war, then those traditional values of women being the ones at home and men going out to fight, that wouldn't exist. Now women would be called up to fight. Now, if this discussion was had today, I think the discussion would be a little different because like military does allow women to fight in combat roles where in the 1970s they didn't. So that could change. Some more other legal scholars argued against the ERA, saying that the 14th Amendment offers equal protection for persons in a state, and women are persons in a state, so they already have equal protection. But women's liberation movement will say that this specifically is mentioning discrimination against sex, so that it's clear to everybody that that's not. So there's different aspects. In the 60s and 70s, we also have what scholars will call the sexual revolution, where people are having more casual extramarital sex. So any sex outside of marriage, premarital sex, adultery. This is becoming more common and more, I guess, less hidden than it was before. It doesn't mean people weren't having sex outside of marriage in the 40s and 50s. It just means that it's not as taboo as it once was. And one of the big catalysts or reasons why this really begins in the 60s and 70s is because the introduction of the birth control pill. The birth control pill had been around since 1910s, 1920s. However, it was not prescribed to women if they were single. It would not be prescribed to women if their husbands objected to it. And so when we get to the 60s and 70s, this is really the first time where now doctors are prescribing it to single women and are prescribing it without asking their husbands for permission, which is weird. Questions about this? Okay, so in the late 60s, we have big spending happening. We have spending on what? Vietnam War, Great Society, right? All that is very expensive, and it's happening at the same time. You also have issues of deindustrialization. Where factories in the United States who remain are leaving places like the Midwest and New England and moving to places like California, Texas, Florida. But many factories are moving south, west. Many are automating. So you can let go of human workers because you have machines replacing them. Many are moving to foreign countries. Right, because they can pay their labor much cheaper than you could in the United States. And you also have foreign competition. So hypothetically, the factories that remain in the United States are maybe higher skilled jobs. They maybe the machines itself that humans need to run are more require more skill or more training, and so those ones remain. However, factories in places like West Germany, Japan, they're getting those good factories too, and so now America's either losing their lower skilled factories to other countries, or they have to compete with countries like Germany and Japan with their higher skilled factories. So deindustrialization is affecting this, and it leads to high unemployment. You're also dealing with an oil embargo created by OPEC, the oil producing company or countries, who are protesting against America's involvement in the Middle East. They don't like what we're doing, so they refuse to sell oil. That'll happen again. This happened in the beginning of the 70s, it happens at the end of the 70s too, during the Iranian Revolution. So multiple times there's oil shortages. So all of this is happening at the same time. They're not necessarily connected to each other. In some ways they are, but they're all kind of independent of each other. And it's all creating this perfect storm leading to high inflation. Right? And none of these things are things like, okay, let's just push a button and we're going to end deindustrialization. They're not going to push a button and, oh, okay, we'll fix the oil embargo. We've solved the Middle East crisis. The cost of the Vietnam War, even though the war is ending by 1973, 75, the costs of that are going to continue, right? It's not just going to fix itself after our soldiers leave next day. Americans now are used to, especially elderly Americans, are used to things like Medicare, which provides them health care after they've retired, right? That's not going away. Old people aren't going to let that happen. So all this stuff is happening, and that creates this inflation where our economy is growing too fast, and our economy isn't able to keep up because of things like the industrialization. And so it leads to high inflation. While there's also unemployment, which is called what? Stagflation. Because you have a period of inflation where our economy is stagnant. What's stagnant mean? It's like staying the same. It's not growing. It's not necessarily getting worse. It's just like staying the same throughout the 70s. And this is a common description of the 70s. Like it just kind of went. Jimmy Carter will give a speech that, in my opinion, kind of undoes him because he talks about this malaise that is laying across the country. And malaise is like you are just sick of everything. You're just waiting for this decade to be over. There's no spirit of working together or powering through these problems. Many Americans will see Carter as blaming Americans for all these economic problems because of this malaise speech. So Carter is going to kind of get the brunt of the blame for inflation. Even though a lot of this happened before he was president, Ford and Nixon both tried to stop inflation before him in the early 70s. They couldn't stop it, but Carter's going to kind of get the blame for not fixing inflation. And that comes from the 1980 election. Okay, that's kind of all I'm thinking for 1970s. Any questions, everybody? Oh, actually. I didn't talk about environmentalism at all. So we get to the 1970s, Americans are getting increasingly worried about the disappearing natural resources. Yeah. Maybe political. I don't know. It's kind of its own category. Let's put it under political just because we're going to see the government seeking change. They're going to be the ones who are going to be a lot fighting for a lot of change. Okay, so they're looking at disappearing natural resources and they're looking for how to protect the environment, right? Which this is not the first time we've had a kind of national call for protecting the environment. When is the last time we've seen a push for conservation? Was Roosevelt did do that because of like the CCC and stuff, but there's actually a time before that. No. Yeah, so that's the progressive era, right? That's the late 1800s. When people fought for conservationism. People like John Muir, or Roosevelt himself, right? They created national parks. He's mentioned the Sierra Club, looking for how to protect the environment. Many of the advocates for conservationism were women. So we have women in the late 1800s fighting for conservation. A lot of the environmentalists in the 1970s are also women. And they are looking for how to fight against the destruction of the environment. Who most likely opposed environment? Yeah, probably going to be business executives. Why would they oppose it? Yeah, this because the ways that they're going to try to protect the environment are going to limit opportunities for businesses, right? We talked about how if you're building a new building somewhere, you have to make sure you're not destroying the environment while you're doing it, right? Or if you do, you have to pay money to build new wetlands somewhere else, right? Or if a business wants to take resources out of the earth, it needs to do so in a responsible way, like the paper industry in Wisconsin. When they're starting to create this paper industry, they're just clear cutting land and moving on to the next field, clear cut the next forest, and then move on to the next forest. Here in the 70s, they start passing rules like, okay, if you're going to cut down like a whole bunch of trees, you need to plant more, right? Now, it doesn't create new trees and mature trees in the next 2 years. It takes 20, 30 years to grow a mature tree. But that's one example, right? Of, okay, we've taken away this resource. Now we have to do something to replenish that resource for the future, right? So that's a change, and all that costs money, right? Do businessmen really want to plant new trees after they cut it down? No, because it's expensive. But if we're forcing them to, then businessmen they don't like that because that costs money. So some of the groups that did this, biggest one is the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, designed to put regulations in place to protect the environment. We talk about things like the Endangered Species Act. First hour, I don't think got to that. That didn't. Second hour didn't get to it. Did I show second hour or fourth hour the map of like the eagle's nest? Okay. There's I can't get it up right now. Look at my great maps of Wisconsin. That is a perfect map of Wisconsin, everybody. If you looked at there's a map that's on the PowerPoint for this. Speaking of cranes, they looked at nests, occupied nests of bald eagles in 1970s, and there's like 10 of them all up in northern Wisconsin in like the 1970s. And the bald eagle became like the example of our extraction of natural resources and its effect on the ecosystem, because our national symbol, a bald eagle, is almost extinct by the 1970s. And so there are things like the Endangered Species Act and others to protect animals and ecosystems. Today, if you look at like 2019, like it's all over. And bald eagles are not extinct right now. They're not even endangered. In fact, they're under the category of least concern right now. because of protections put in place for eagles and other birds of prey. Yeah. It penalizes if you would like, if you killed the bald eagle, you shot it out of the sky or something. Bald eagle is going to be like next level, like we're going to protect this animal because it's our national symbol, but other animals too, certain caliber, like be protected, like condors, a big one in the 70s. Okay. What's that? I think that's it for the 1970s. Any questions about that? Okay. We have about 5 minutes left. Do you have any questions about civil rights movements of the 60s or the Vietnam War era? Vietnam War? Anything about it specifically? I only have 5 minutes. Freedom Riders, SDLC, yeah. Not necessarily the presidents in order, but like you should know things like Johnson is the one that brings lots of soldiers into Vietnam, right? Nixon is the one who is going to start pulling them up, right? So in some ways, yes, you'll kind of know the presidents in order just inherently by knowing what they did. Ford comes after because Ford has to come after Nixon because he pardons Nixon, right? So, okay. So, okay, so two organizations and one kind of more movement that consists of other organizations. SCLC is going to be typically older, more religious. SNCC is going to be younger, less religious. The Black Power movement, it kind of depends on which organization you're talking about. Black Panther Party is going to be typically younger, less religious. Nation of Islam is going to be, I don't know if there's really a younger, older, but more religious, tied to Islam. SDLC initially is less confrontational, right? And so that's why we have things early on like the boycotts. SNCC is more confrontational. That's why we have things like the sit-in movements, right? And the success of the sit-in movements, of the freedom rides, where they do sit-ins throughout the South, leads groups like the SCLC to say, okay, maybe being more confrontational is the way to do it. And so then they would eventually become more confrontational and support things like Project C. Where is Project C done? In Birmingham, right? And that's when Martin Luther King Jr. came in, led to a letter from Birmingham jail where he defended the use of nonviolent civil disobedience, right? So King has kind of led the change from less confrontational to more confrontational by intentionally breaking the law. Right? The boycott was started by what? Rosa Parks, right? So her action was breaking the law, but the rest of the boycott, that's not breaking laws, right? And so we've seen it become less confrontational to more confrontational. For the Black Power movement, this is going to gain power kind of after a lot of the post Civil Rights Act. 65-ish, 64-ish, right? So a lot of these laws are coming down off the books that segregated people. And so Black Power movement is kind of coming into national prominence after the goal of getting rid of segregation has been met. And so the Black Power movement is kind of looking, okay, what is going to happen next? And so we see some groups are going to argue for Black pride. In certain cases, separatism, so that African Americans have control of their businesses, politics in a local area. Depending on the group, some Black Power movements will use violence for self-defense. Okay. Not all Black Power movements groups will, but some will. And focusing on helping the community. Black Panther movement or Black Panther Party is going to do this with helping give free daycare programs to kids, free breakfast for kids before school, stuff like that. Kind of different perspectives on how to fight for more rights, more opportunities, and we can see not only does it change depending on which group you're in or your demographic, but also changes on like what year it is, right? Early on, we have more of these confrontational sit-in or marches movements when they're fighting against legal segregation. And then later on, it's more focusing on like helping community, focusing on how the system should be set up after 1965. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, that's the march where they're protesting against voting restrictions. And so they were going to walk from Selma, Alabama to the capital, Montgomery. And they actually made an attempt at first, but it was stopped by police officers who used batons and horses and tear gas to stop them. So they had to stop the march. They tried again a couple days later, and they were successful. They gained media support. Okay, that's where we'll close it off for today, everybody.